this recording will cover part 2 of chapter 3. I know I got rushed at the end of the last one. But so this is what, your textbook talks about how to increase intensity. So, maybe go to 6 students, and I think I said 5. In tier 2, 3 or fewer in tier 3. I always used to think tier 3 is a little smaller, 1 or 2 students, but there are some different numbers, depending on where you are, of course. Increase instructional time, change instructional practices, change the interventionist to someone with greater expertise. So these are all ways you can increase intensity. And the involvement of the special ed teacher at this point, is helping teachers make adaptations and accommodations and assist them in decisions about instruction. So again, sometimes it just depends who delivers that tier 3 or those tier 3 interventions. So tier 1, again, gen ed classroom instruction for all students, evidence-based, screening, progress monitoring. Tier 2, instruction for some, right? Intervention for students not making adequate progress. So it's still not considered special ed. And this is a fixed duration, maybe we're going to say, okay, for 9 weeks, right? For a, what's it called? A quarter in the elementary schools. We're going to do this intervention, this tier 2 with continued monitoring. And then tier 3 is even more intense for students who make minimal progress, right? So kind of that lack of response to intervention. And this is something that's really important to remember. It may or may not be special ed. Again, it just kind of depends on the school system. Potato, potato, it's still tier 3, okay? So this is from the 9th edition, actually, and I just wanted to kind of reiterate, as a result of the recommended use of RTI, eligibility and identification criteria for a learning disability are described as follows. Not required to consider a severe discrepancy between achievement and intellectual ability. So that was the initial way of finding a learning disability, right? So we may, or the LEA may use a process that determines if a student responds to scientific research-based intervention as part of the evaluation. Or again, you can look at it the other way. Do they fail to respond? Okay, so this is just a couple other, just wanted to reiterate a couple things. I like this term preventative interventions. I saw that somewhere. I said, ooh, I need to use that. So typically, we're seeing a lot more in general education classes, RTI or MTS squared, right? And universal design for learning. We will talk about universal design for learning later on in the semester, but I just wanted to throw it out there that both UDL and RTI, MTS squared, lots of letters in special ed if you have not figured that out yet, right? We've already talked about LRE, we talked about FAPE, we talked about IEPs, lots of letters is kind of alphabet soup. Hard to keep them a little straight sometimes. But anyway, so some preventative interventions to address the needs of students who exhibit learning and or behavioral, right, kind of talking about the same thing, problems, but who have not yet been referred for special ed. So this is intervention occurs within the gen ed classroom, again, potato potato about tier 3, but assistance is provided from a special ed teacher, from a interventionist, something like that. And the goal is to provide solutions without formally referring a child for special ed, right? And we talked about that. We don't want to just refer everybody for special education because then it's not special anymore. And B, we want to make sure that students who are being referred, really are the ones who need it. Being labeled, quote unquote, as a special ed student it has a negative stigma for students. So we want to make sure that we're not over identifying or over labeling students. Okay, so again, RTI was, and you could really substitute MTS squared here too, was in IDEIA, if you will, 2004. It's an alternative process recommended for identifying students potentially eligible for services under the category of learning disabilities. Basically replaces, as we talked about, the IQ achievement discrepancy model. All right, so just to kind of spell it out again, tier 1, first level of intervention, this is whole class, right? Everybody gets this. Tier 2, maybe about 5 to 10%. Think about that yellow on the graphic that I showed you a few minutes ago. Teachers reach out to pre-referral intervention team. We used to have, it was called like a student assistant team. So if there was a 2nd grade teacher who was struggling with, this group of students, she or he would bring the data and everything to the team meetings, and then, and especially a teacher, I was a part of all the K2 meetings, and the other resource teacher was a part of the 3-5 meetings, grades 3-5, and we would come up with some strategies, some ideas, that the gen ed teacher could then implement. And then tier 3, about 3 to 5% of students, smaller groups, individualized, and more intense. Oh, I totally skipped this one. So going back, that's what I just showed you all a few minutes ago. So keep this slide in mind as we continue forward talking about RTI and MTS squared. Okay, so implementing interventions, we want to make sure that we're using a standard treatment protocol, right? Provide the same treatment for all students who require intervention. And treatment, means interventions or something like that. It doesn't mean like a medical treatment. That's typically what people think when they hear the word medical treatment. Not what it means, right? We're not sending them to the hospital. We're not giving them any medication. We're providing interventions. Research-based, of course, problem-solving model, where we want to define the problem, analyze the problem, develop and implement a plan, evaluate after 10 weeks. Again, a lot of schools use 9 weeks just because that's kind of the grading period, at the school, but 9, 10 weeks, something like that. You want to give your plan enough time to work. So you don't want to implement it once and say, oh, it didn't work. We have to identify this child right away. Well, no, that defeats the whole purpose of response to intervention, MTS squared. Okay. So we want to look at the individual student data, adequate responders, they might improve academically. Like let's say we move that group of 5 students up here to tier 2, right? And 3 of them start responding really well. They're now off the charts. Well, guess what? They probably don't need tier 2 anymore. You could just move them back to just regular old tier 1. Okay, so students can move in and out of tiers. And inadequate responders, or those who fail to respond, as I've said it, they continue to need interventions. So how team members facilitate these systems, again, reviewing the progress monitoring data of students and the whole school, right? When you do that screening of the whole school, you need to look, we used to have reports by by teacher and then by grade level also. So we could kind of look at the grade level as a whole and say, okay, we have, these 22 students in 2nd grade who are not really where we want them to be. What are we going to do with these 22 students? Okay, you want to make sure you're observing, providing relevant professional development to educators, assisting with data collection, facilitating instructional decision making, identifying students for tier 2 and tier 3. That comes from the gen ed teacher a lot. That you might bring a student to the student support team and say, hey, I'm really struggling with this student or this group of students. What can we do? Can we make some decisions? Organize intervention groups and communicate with parents and professionals. So again, it is a team effort, okay? It shouldn't just be you as the gen ed teacher doing all this. But what the gen ed teachers, and I know some of you are hoping to be special ed teachers, some of you are hoping to be gen ed teachers. So, the gen ed teachers, the role is providing that high quality instruction from the get-go to everybody, right? Tier 1, everybody. Conduct screening, identify students who need intervention. Again, when I taught in Charleston as a resource teacher, I was the one who did the screening those 3 times a year, but that's not always the case. That was just something my principal had me do. Okay, you're going to provide evidence-based interventions that improve learning, monitor the effects of the intervention. Are they responding? Are they not responding? And collaborate and consult with special ed teachers and others on the decision-making teams. The special ed teachers, you're going to work with the gen ed teachers, collaborating, identifying students. You're going to help identify students who might be struggling or who might be, not adequately responding. And then you're going to offer possibly intensive interventions for tier 3 students, whether it's you teaching, you as a special ed teacher teaching these interventions or providing them, or whether it's just you going to the gen ed teacher and saying, oh, okay, here's a great idea you could do for tier 3. Again, just depends on who implements tier 3, which is not the same from school to school. So we really want to think about using data, right? That's really important. We're not just looking at a student saying, oh, well, they're not making progress. No, we want to look at the data. We want to have the graphs to show the progress or the lack of progress. So you want to collect the data during progress monitoring. You want to use comprehensive evaluations for inadequate responders, develop a profile of the student's strengths and needs. So what areas are they strong in? And what areas do they struggle or do they have some needs? You can make some comparison to the peers if you need to, and then the team reviews all data to develop an intervention plan. And if I have time at the end of this video, I will show you a graph of an example that I had from a student that I taught way back when. So providing interventions, again, gen ed teacher provides tier 2 interventions, 3 to 5 times per week, 20 minutes or more, same ability groups. And again, this kind of is dependent on what your what you have available, in terms of time and how many days per week, stuff like that. And you're going to progress monitor, systematic routine, quick pacing, independent practice, all of these things that we'll talk more about as the semester goes on. Provide instruction at appropriate levels. So if they're struggling, if they're in second grade and they're struggling with sight words, you're not going to provide them instruction on the fourth grade level, right? And assume they're going to make progress, because that would just be silly. And you're going to use intensive interventions. Okay, so what these two systems can and cannot do, they don't create or fix learning disabilities. They can help prevent learning disabilities from being, a struggle, right? If a student has a learning disability, they're going to have a learning disability, but these two systems can support those students. And maybe with the right support, maybe they won't need to, quote, go into special ed. And I don't mean that as a place. So allow students to move between tiers. Again, they can go from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 1, tier 1, 2, 3, who knows, and provides effective instruction with appropriate resources and support. And it's early, right? We're starting this as early as kindergarten. We're not waiting for them to fail. Okay, students, these two systems for students who are culturally and linguistically diverse, also called CLD. I didn't want to throw another abbreviation at you. It could potentially improve outcomes for students and more accurately determines which students might need special ed services. Again, not just looking at a student and saying, oh, well, they're a culturally and linguistically diverse student, we're going to identify them as a special ed, as a student, a special ed student. No, no, no. We need to look at their responses, their lack of responses to interventions. And we should identify whether students' performance relates to instructional content, instructional practices, language, or background experiences. If we have a student for whom English is not their first language and they're struggling with, ELA, does that necessarily mean it's a disability? No, not really, right? We need to take their language, their language into account. Whew, I just had a coughing fit. I almost choked. No, not really, but I had to pause the video for a second. But we also want to look at the instructional practices. Is the teacher actually teaching them to read? Or is that not even part of the instructional practices? So we need to make sure whether the student's performance, is any of these things, and if we can rule these things out, or something easy like a vision impairment or a vision problem. Maybe they need glasses. That's not a learning disability, right? All right. So, couple more slides. Working with families. We want to make sure we're informing families of child participation, especially, once they move to tier 2, we want to at least keep the parents or the families involved and say, hey, here's what's going on. Here's the process. Maybe even show that triangle. To me, it really clarifies things. Provide written intervention plans to the families, duration of intervention, length of lessons. So it's formal, but not as formal as an IEP per se. But the families should still be involved. They should know what's going on. So then if the student does end up moving to tier 3 and then a possible referral to special education, it's not a surprise, right? So the parents know, the families know what's going on. They're not surprised by all of a sudden you saying, oh, hey, this student, we're going to refer the student for special education services. Keep them in the loop and get their consent. And again, this is dependent, some schools require a little more formal consent, some schools don't. I'm always in favor of getting consent. And then providing updates about the child's progress. Okay, so RTI and MTS squared are typically used elementary, early elementary, stuff like that. It is a little trickier to use in middle and high schools. Some districts, and I cannot tell you which districts because I haven't been to schools in a while, use these systems in grades 6 through 8. There's a lot of collaboration involved between content area teachers, reading coaches, stuff like that to help with content reading strategies. May include providing vocabulary comprehension, learning activities, and may include interventions for at-risk students with reading problems. Again, much of the research has been done in elementary schools, but we need to get it more into the middle and high schools. Okay, I'm going to pause for 1 second and show you a graph real quick. Okay, that was totally a bold-faced lie because I cannot switch to using the webcam once I already started the recording, so I cannot show you a graph. But when we get into the chapters about oral reading fluency, I think it's chapters, oh goodness, like chapter 7, chapter 8, I will show you some graphs and some examples of what RTI might look like to actually show parents and to have as a reference point. So I will show you the books and the graphs. So total bold-faced lie, don't listen to me. All right, so that is it for chapter 3. And just again, keep this. This is what I'm going to leave you with, our little picture right there, because I think this really helps to clarify tier 1, tier 2, tier 3.